Memoir of Charles de Langlade by Joseph Tass, published 1876 by the State Historical Society of Wisconsin, read by Cody Cole, author of Auke-wingeke-tawso, or Defender of His Country, The Circumstances and Services of Charles Marcel de Langlade, published 2024 by Tellwell. Among the numerous memoirs published by the State Historical Society of Wisconsin concerning the primitive epoch of the Northwest is a very interesting narrative, full of curious and stirring episodes, under the title of 72 Years' Recollections of Wisconsin. This account embraces nearly 3/4 of a century. The narrator was engaged during many years in the fur trade, which yielded him a considerable competency. Afterwards, he retired to Butte des Morts in the state of Wisconsin, where he died at a very advanced age. It was to that place that Mr. Lyman C. Draper, author of many historical works, went to find Captain Grignon, then almost an octogenarian, and gathered from his own lips these precious reminiscences, which, without him, would probably have been lost to history. This visit of Mr. Draper was made in 1857. Augustin Grignon enjoyed at that time, in spite of the frosts of age, a health still robust, a rare fidelity of memory, and to the simple habits of the olden time, he enjoyed polished and agreeable manners, dividing his leisure between reading and the pleasures of fishing and hunting. The Memoir of Grignon comprises 100 printed pages, and has the great merit of bringing to light men and facts before unknown, and often of considerable importance. The persons whom he introduces upon the pages of history are almost all from among the Canadians, whom love of lucre and passion for adventure had attracted, at an early day, in great numbers, to the unexplored regions of the West. Many of them assuredly do not merit the oblivion which seems reserved for them, but none is more entitled to our sympathy and admiration than Charles de Langlade, for he was not only one of the first pioneers of the West, but also one of the most courageous defenders of the French cause in Canada. Grignon had most of the facts, which he recounts directly from the mouth of this Canadian hero, his illustrious ancestor, which gives them more than ordinary interest. One might, it is true, doubt the impartiality of the recital, if it had been proven that Langlade had diminished, rather than exaggerated, the importance of the role played by himself. We have been able to complete and correct his memoir in more than one respect, and we can esteem ourselves fortunate in having been permitted to contribute to the restoration of history of a name not less glorious for having been forgotten. The Langlade family, at first known by the name of Moet de Morris, came originally from Castle Saracen and in Gaillon, France. Pierre Moet, landlord of Morris, ensign in the company of the regiment of Carignan, ancestor of so many Canadian families, settled in 1668 at Three Rivers. His children were 7 sons and 2 daughters, namely, Pierre, Jacques, René, Louis, surnamed Sieur le Delaborde, Michel, Joseph, Marie, Madeleine, and Theresa. The eldest, Pierre, was also an ensign in the army. His residence was Three Rivers, and by his marriage with Elizabeth Juntress, he had several children, whose baptismal names were Marie, François, Marie-Josette, Jean-Baptiste, Marie-Marguerite, Didas, Augustin, and Isabel. Augustin was born at Three Rivers in the month of September 1703. Hence, Grignon's memoir errs in stating that Augustin first saw light in France, that he early served in the French army, and that probably through an example of many relatives who had enlisted, he decided to go and seek his fortune in Canada. He was the first who bore the name Sieur de Langlade, which continued thereafter attached to the family of which he became the head. Augustin de Langlade early engaged in the fur trade, and to that end settled at Michilimackinac, or Mackinac. This post was then a very important one in that business. It was the principal station where the tribes of the West came to exchange the products of the chase for European merchandise. The natives had, moreover, a profound respect for this island, which they regarded as the favorite abode of their Manitou. It was indeed worthy to be a resort for their spirits, for it's extremely picturesque and has been appropriately called by tourists, quote, the Venice of the lakes. Augustin de Langlade established a considerable commerce in peltry, and for that purpose he obtained, according to usage, a license from the French government. He married at Mackinac Domatilda, widow of Daniel Villeneuve, the sister of the principal chief of the Ottawas, the king Nesoquet, called by the Canadians La Forge, or the Fork, and his allegiance contributed not a little to give him great influence over that numerous tribe. Madame de Langlade, by her marriage with Daniel Villeneuve, had several children: Daniel, Anne, Marie-Louise Theresa, Jean-Baptiste, Agathe, and Constance Stanislas. Daniel was born in September 1712, Anne on the 8th of April 1735, and married to Antoine Guillaury, and again in 1745 to one B. Blondeau. Marie-Louise Theresa, on the 2nd of October 1736, at the age of 16, married Claude Germain Gautier de Verville, a son. Agathe, born in February 1724, was married to M. Soligny, a severe and cruel man. She survived him, subsequently marrying Amable Grignon, and died at Green Bay at a great age, leaving no children. The Grignon Memoir erroneously affirms that these children were the fruit of the marriage of Augustin de Langlade and Madame Villeneuve, and that Agathe was the oldest. Charles Michel de Langlade was born at Mackinac near the beginning of May 1729, not 1724 as the Grignon narrative states, and was baptized on the 9th day of that month. Thus isolated from civilization, our young islander was enabled, meantime, to gather other knowledge than that ordinarily acquired under the itinerant wigwam. A successor to Pierre Marquette, probably Father Dujardin, gave him lessons and commenced his education. If circumstances were unfavorable to the completion of his mental culture, he could not least have his belligerent instincts awakened at a very young age and enter upon the stern avocation of war. A singular circumstance gave him an opportunity to assist in a serious engagement at an age when the noise of arms ordinarily inspires only fear. In 1734, the Ottawas became engaged in a struggle with a native tribe allied to the English. Twice the young man had attempted the assault, and twice they had been repulsed. The French commandant at Mackinac vainly solicited them to renew their attack. They obstinately refused. At last, the great chief, La Forge, like all natives, superstitious, believed himself to have seen in a dream that the enemy could only be put to rout by having a young Langlade accompany the expedition. Entreaties were urged with the father, who permitted his son to join the Ottawas, but like Chevalier Bayard in the olden time, the young hero was pledged to his father never to dishonor him in the arms. The Ottawas, full of new confidence, rushed with ardor to attack the village of the enemy, which they took possession of with the terrible war whoop used by the natives in combat. This lad was evidently protected by some powerful Manitou, as the Ottawas only took up their war hatchet when they were accompanied by someone whom the spirits protected. This fact explains the remarkable influence which he had from the very first over this tribe, always so friendly to the French. The Grignon Memoir says that Augustin and Charles Langlade, about 1745, removed from Mackinac to the Bay of Las Pointes, known now by the less prosaic name of Green Bay. According to the memoir above mentioned, the Langlades had first pitched their tents on Fox River, and thus became the principal proprietors of the neighboring soil, then covered with dense forest as far as the eye could reach. Around them settled de la Saugny, a Menominee chief, called by the Canadians M. Caron, and some natives. Such was the infancy of the state of Wisconsin, such the first civilizing moments in these solitary woods. The Outagamis or Foxes were established at this epoch at the Little Butte de Mort on the west bank of the Fox River, about 37 miles from Green Bay. An imitation of the Ottawas, who claimed possession of that river of the name, they required pay from every canoe that went up or down that stream. As soon as they perceived a craft, They lighted a torch atop one of their posts of observation to indicate to the voyageurs that they must approach the shore and pay the exacted tribute. To refuse compliance with this imposition was to expose themselves to the discontent of the Foxes and to acts of pillage. For a long time this extraction weighed upon the traders, who complained many times to the commandants of the western posts and even to the governor of Canada. But their representations having had no effect, Captain Morin, of French origin and one of the principal traders of the country, finally decided to organize an expedition against them himself, which had the effect to drive them from their villages, kill a great number, and to crowd them away into the forest. The Sacs, who had killed Captain de Villiers, commandant of the little garrison of Green Bay, in a difficulty which he had with them, was also severely punished. Charles de Langlade, at the head of the inhabitants of the Green Bay, took an active part in the campaign, which was made with a view to avenging the death of this French officer. While Charles de Langlade thus exhibited his courage in the obscure combats of tribe against tribe, events in Canada were becoming complicated, and threatened to take a serious turn. Grave difficulties had arisen between France and England in Acadia and the valley of the Ohio, on the subject of the frontier boundaries, and although peace still existed, there had been already some bloody encounters in the wilderness, and it was evident that, on either side, the first occasion would be seized to come to blows. Thus, the killing of a French officer, M. de Jumonville, sent as an envoy to George Washington at the head of 30 soldiers for the purpose of summoning the English to evacuate entrenchments raised by them near the Ohio, was the signal for that long and terrible 7 Years' War, which kindled the fires of 2 continents, and led to consequences so disastrous to France. Vaudreuil, governor of the colony, took the necessary measures to cope with the enemy, and hastened to arm the regular troops and Canadian militia. The natives of the Northwest joined the coureurs de bois, so numerous at that time, also furnished a valuable contingent, and he, without hesitation, confided this command to Charles de Langlade, whose exploits were already well known to him. United to the natives by their ties of blood, by singularity of habit, familiarity with their dialects, and with their modes of warfare, of acknowledged bravery and ability, enjoying unquestionable authority and influence, Langlade was exactly the man for the situation. At his appeal, the tomahawk was unearthed, the tribes incited themselves with enthusiasm, and a crowd of native warriors gathered around the folds of the French flag. We find at the head of these Indian bands many celebrated chiefs, among them, it is believed, the famous Pontiac, who some years later became illustrious by his conspiracy against the English. After organizing his forces, Langlade received orders to direct his steps with all haste towards Fort Duquesne, of which General Braddock, recently arrived from England with veteran troops, was about to attempt acquire possession of, in order to drive the French out of the valley of the Ohio. Langlade arrived at Fort Duquesne in the beginning of July 1755. La Sieur de la Prade, as well as some French and Indians, sent to observe the hostile army, whose least movements were watched, and announced on the 8th of July that it was only half a day's journey from the Monongahela, and that it was advancing in 3 columns. On the receipt of these tidings, the commandant at Fort Duquesne decided to oppose the advance of the enemy, and for this purpose, de Beaujeu organized a force of about 250 French and about 650 Indians. Leaving the fort on the 9th of July, at 9 o'clock in the morning, de Beaujeu found himself at 12:30 in the presence of the English, just at the instant when they halted on the south shore of the Monongahela. The French and Indians had not yet been perceived by the enemy, and they placed themselves carefully in ambush in the ravines and thick woods which formed an impassable belt on the steep bank in front of them. The action commenced with vigor, and took the army of Braddock by surprise. Officers and soldiers ran to their arms with such precipitation that many of their leaders still had their napkins on their breasts from breakfast when found amongst the dead. As they occupied lower ground than the French, they fired over their heads, and only hit a small number. The French and Indians, meanwhile, concealed behind the trees, were, so to speak, invisible, and they returned the fire of the enemy by a terrible fusillade, which scattered death and consternation amongst the English battalions. At last the soldiers of Braddock took flight, and both the Canadians and Indians charged upon them with tomahawks, forcing them to throw themselves into the water of the Monongahela, where many of them were drowned. This was a disastrous day for the English. Braddock, who wished to make war after the European manner in the forests of the Ohio, and had been unwilling to take advice from anyone, paid for his temerity with his life and the loss of the largest part of his army. The bodies of some hundreds of soldiers and many officers strewed the battlefield, and immense booty fell into the hands of the French. Had it not been for the Virginia militia, commanded by George Washington, protecting the retreat of the fragments of the English army, that portion of the natives who did not loiter to pillage the dead would not, in all probability, have spared a solitary soldier to tell the story of their sanguinary defeat. The French did not lose 30 men, and the most of these were killed not by English balls, but by the branches of the trees which sheltered them, and which were violently torn off by the fire of the enemy's artillery. This victory was the most brilliant because the French had only an inferior force with which to oppose the army of Braddock, numbering at least 2,500 men, which constrained Washington to say, quote, "We have been beaten, shamefully beaten, by a handful of Frenchmen." End quote. After the rout of the English, Langlade took energetic measures to prevent the natives from seizing the stores of liquors belonging to the enemy, for once under the influence of the liquid fire, they might have been carried to excess, and this would have tarnished the glory of a day so fortunate. Frustrated in their attempt, the Indians set about searching the bodies of the English dead, laying by hundreds on the bloody field. Many of the officers wore rich uniforms, and they despoiled them of every valuable artifice they might have upon them. Besides the Indians, many Canadians took part in the combat under the command of Langlade. Among them his brother-in-law Soligny, his nephew Gautier de Verville, Pierre Coiret, La Choice, La Fortune, Aimable de Guerre, Philip de Rocheblav, and Louis Hamelin, all won by the brave conduct the congratulations of their chief. The Indians were not alone in their desire to despoil the vanquished. Many of the details now given are not to be found in any of the writers who have recounted the battle of the Monongahela. They are neither recorded in the elaborate narrative of Winthrop Sargent, author of History of Braddock's Expedition, nor in the official reports collected in the archives of the Ministry of War at Paris. One might be surprised at the decisive part taken by Langlade in this battle, one of the most remarkable in American history, but the numerous proofs given by him of military genius, the similar brilliant services which he would have rendered some years later at the siege of Quebec, if only his urgent advice had been taken, as we shall see later on, make it evident that it is not impossible that the honor of this victory belongs entirely to Langlade. Langlade is not, however, alone in affirming that he took an important part in this battle. An English general and an English officer, writing some years afterward, affirmed that Langlade alone could claim the merit of this brilliant victory. Thomas on Burney, an officer in the army of General John Burgoyne, wrote in 1777 from the borders of Lake Champlain, quote, "We are expecting the Ottawas. They are led by M. de St. Luc and M. de Langlade, both great partisans of the French cause in the last war. The latter is the person who, at the head of the tribe which he now commands, planned and executed the defeat of General Braddock." End quote. Burgoyne himself, the unfortunate commander of the aforesaid army, expressed himself in a no less formal manner in a letter to Lord George Germain, dated Skanesborough, July the 11th, 1777. Quote, "I am informed that the Ottawas and other Indian tribes, who are 2 days' march from us, are brave and faithful, and that they practice war and not pillage. They are under the orders of M. St. Luc, a Canadian of merit, and one of the best partisans of the French cause during the last war, and of M. de Langlade, the very man with whom these tribes projected and executed Braddock's defeat." End quote. It will be remarked that these two passages just cited were written many days before the arrival of Langlade in the camp of Burgoyne, and that, consequently, he cannot be accused of having inspired them. Burgoyne and Alberni point out the decisive part taken by Langlade in the victory of the Monongahela as a fact fully recognized by the English military, at a time when it was easy to be well informed in regard to the conduct of each person in the then late war. Pierre Pouchot, an officer of the French army, notes in his memoirs, quote, "The battle of the Monongahela was the most fierce and glorious in which natives ever engaged, and to them we ought to give the glory of it owing to their unerring fire." End quote. If the natives greatly aided the French troops in gaining this brilliant victory, should not we attribute a large part of their success to their principal commander, Langlade? In respect to Beaujeu, it is only just to mention that the other accounts of the Battle of the Monongahela represented him in a more favorable light than the preceding recital. According to one of them, he had been obliged, before leaving Fort Duquesne, to go to meet Braddock's army, to contend with the fears of the Indians, who hesitated to march against an enemy superior in numbers, and he encouraged them to follow him by these energetic words, quote, "I am determined to go and meet the enemy. What, will you allow your father to go alone? I am sure to conquer them." End quote. He was prepared for death by receiving the Holy Communion with a party of his soldiers the evening before the battle, and he had shown great courage and rare skill as a commander himself, not losing a single instant in commencing the attack, and falling mortally wounded at the first fire of the enemy. After the death of Beaujeu, Dumas, his lieutenant, took command of the troops, and at their head bravely finished the victory already commenced. Other narratives of the battle are full of the same representations. However that may be, it seems certain that, without wishing to strip from de Beaujeu and Dumas the glory which properly belongs to them, we may claim for Langlade a large share of this brilliant victory. After the defeat of Braddock, Langlade probably returned to Green Bay, and then went back again the following year to enter the service of Fort Duquesne. We possess few details on this subject, but we know that on the 9th of August, 1756, Dumas, commander at Fort Duquesne now, sent him secretly at the head of a certain number of French and Indians to ascertain whether the English were making a movement in the direction of the Ohio. Dumas's order is couched in the following terms, quote, "Dumas, Chevalier of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis, Captain of Infantry, Commandant of the Ohio and its tributaries. It is ordered that Sieur Langlade, ensign of the infantry, start at the head of a detachment of French and Indians to go in the direction of Fort Cumberland. In case the natives prefer to quit the great highway, Sieur Langlade will, with the French, detach himself from them in order to follow them. The principal object of this mission being to examine if the enemy is making any movement in that part. He will march with caution and distrust to avoid all surprises and any ambuscade. If he strikes in conjunction with his Indian allies, he will employ all his talent to prevent them from falling to the exercise of any cruelty upon those who fall into their hands." Done at Fort Duquesne, the 9th of August, 1756. In 1757, Langlade came down from the west at the head of several hundred Indians to strengthen the forces of Montcalm, then on the eve of becoming more seriously engaged. He took part in the Grand Council held at Montreal during the summer, in which the tribes of the West declared to M. de Vaudreuil that they were ready to obey his wishes and march to the destruction of Fort George, also known as Fort William Henry. The English were entrenched in that stronghold, situated on the border of Lake George, and it was important to destroy it in order to prevent their incursions upon the Canadian frontier. It is known from a letter by Montcalm dated July 25, 1757, that Langlade took part in a rather important expedition previous to the taking of Fort George, or Fort William Henry, which had the best results. Quote, "The Ottawa that I have sent to the lake shore had conceived the project of making an attack on the English barges, where Monsieur Le Corbière de Langlade, Hôtel de Chambly, de Chevalier de Maloys, and La Chapelle were sent with them. They remained in ambush all day yesterday and during the night. At daybreak, the English appeared on the lake to the number of 22 barges, including 2 skiffs. Their detachment numbered 350 men, commanded by Colonel Parker, who was at the head of the Jersey regiment in place of Colonel Schuyler, taken prisoner at Oswego. The yells of our natives so filled them with terror that they made but feeble resistance. Only 2 barges were saved, all the rest being taken or sunk. The Indians brought away 6, which will be very useful to us. I have here 151 prisoners, of whom 8 are officers, 160 were killed, drowned, or put to torture. M. de la Corbière commanded this detachment. This affair cost us 1 Indian slightly wounded." Montcalm vigorously pushed the works necessary to the attack upon Fort William Henry, and he fully recognized the value of the active cooperation given him by the Indians at this juncture. Fort William Henry was admirably situated to defend itself advantageously, but such was the ardor of the besiegers that it was obliged to capitulate after several days' resistance in the beginning of August, 1757. Unhappily, the Indians, by some excess, detracted from the value of their services which they had rendered to the French army. For on the day after the capitulation, when the English quitted the fort, to be confined in the entrenchments which had been assigned them, the Indians threw themselves upon the prisoners, uttering loud yells, and massacred more than 50 of them, in spite of the courageous efforts of the French officers to prevent this butchery. A memoir of that period informs us that the Ottawas present at the siege of Fort William Henry numbered 337, and that, quote, Messieurs de Langlade, Flourmont, Herbin, and the Abbé Matavet were connected with this Indian detachment. At the end of the campaign of 1757, Vaudreuil resolved to recompense the services of Langlade by making him second in command at the post of Michilimackinac, with a salary of 1,000 francs per year. This appointment was made in the following terms. Quote, Pierre Rigaud de Vaudreuil, Governor and Lieutenant General for the Kings in all New France, lands and regions of Louisiana. Sieur Langlade, ensign of the troops detached from the marine, is ordered to depart from this city immediately in order to report to the post of Michilimackinac, where he will serve in the capacity of second officer under the orders of M. de Beaujeu, commandant at said post. Vaudreuil, done at Montreal, the 8th of September, 1757. The following year, Langlade returned to the field of active duty to partake of the glory and the perils of those grand military operations which, while covering the French arms with glory, exhausted the number of their defenders and ruined their resources. Augustin Grignon says Langlade took part in the famous Battle of Ticonderoga, where the English army, on the 9th of July, 1758, commanded by General Abercrombie, was beaten like the French formerly at Crécy, with forces 5 times superior to those of the enemy. Langlade was afterwards dispatched to Fort Duquesne, which was again menaced by the English. General Forbes, in fact, left Philadelphia without delay, at the head of a considerable army, directing his course towards the Ohio in order to seize upon Fort Duquesne. But on learning that a portion of his little army, under the command of Major Grant, had already reached the environs of the fort, the commandant, M. de Ligneris, advanced bravely to the encounter and repulsed the English so vigorously that they lost about 400 men and had about as many wounded. It was unfortunately destined that the expenditure of so much courage should be entirely lost, for M. de Ligneris, forced by the lack of supplies, was obliged to send away many Canadians and reduce his garrison to only 200 men. Further resistance thus became impossible. So when at the end of November the English, still commanded by Forbes, pressed forward with his main body, M. de Ligneris destroyed the fort which he could no longer defend, and retired with his men, a portion to Fort Venago, others to the Mississippi. The loss of so important a post as Fort Duquesne was unhappily but the forerunner of the terrible reverses which were soon to strike the entire French army. We have now reached 1759. Fortune hitherto favored the French, but it is about to desert. Numbers will at last crush the handful of brave men in Canada, abandoned by France, but firmly resolved to surrender only at the last extremity, and to be buried, if need be, under the ruins of their country. A memorable year, when from the fort at Quebec, those old colors with the fleur-de-lis, which had proudly waved there since the days of Champlain, were destined to forever disappear. The Memoir of the Affairs of Canada from 1749 to 1760 informs us that Langlade left Michilimackinac in the month of June, 1759, and went with a numerous party of Indians designed as a strong reinforcement to the Canadian authorities. Quote, 200 natives of the nations around Michilimackinac, commanded by Sieur Langlade, half-pay officer, established amongst them, arrived at Montreal, June 23rd, and immediately descended to Quebec. End quote. Pierre Pouchot tells us in his memoirs on the last war in North America that, quote, Messieurs de la Vendée, one of the discoverers of the Rocky Mountains and of the Sea of the West, and de Langlade, descended the great river with 1,200 Christineaux, Sault, Sauk, Menominee, Chippewa, and Foxes. End quote. Langlade came to offer anew his valiant sword to Montcalm, who, the first of our heroes, had only heroes under his command. He came to assist in the last stages of that grand struggle, where so many times his courage and skill had shone forth conspicuously. He was not slow to demonstrate that no one better than he, perhaps, was equal to the difficult situation in which the French army was about to be placed. It is no part of our plan to recount the great military feats which were to decide the fate of France in this country, Canada. It suffices us to say that the English troops, constantly augmented by new reinforcements, struck simultaneous powerful blows in different parts of the country to crush the French once and for all by power of numbers. While Fort Niagara, the key to our vast domains in the west, fell under the assaults of Generals Prideaux and Johnson, General Amherst seized on his part of Forts Ticonderoga and Crown Point, with the intention to go afterwards and reinforce the troops commanded by Wolfe, which, to the number of 12,000 men, arrived in sight of Quebec on board a considerable fleet in June 1759. The French, on their side, did not remain inactive, and were preparing to give them a warm reception. Their troops went into camp between the river St. Charles and the falls of Montmorency to obstruct the passage of the enemy. They were divided into 3 corps, the left commanded by the Chevalier de Lévis, the right by the Marquis de Vaudeville, and the center by the Marquis de Montcalm. On the 9th of July, the largest part of Wolfe's army disembarked below the falls of Montmorency and established itself upon the left side of this river with the powerful artillery, which more than once obliged the French forces encamped on the opposite bank to change position. On the 25th of July, a detachment of Wolfe's army, 2,000 strong, had imprudently pushed a reconnaissance across the wood almost to the French entrenchments. Langlade, who watched their movements at the head of a numerous party of Indians, which he had placed in ambush in order to surround the English, made many vain applications to the French authorities to induce them to support him in an attack he had projected against the enemy. This was unfortunate, for if they had followed his counsel, this surprise would in all probability have had the most disastrous result, and the whole English detachment, a prey to the greatest consternation, would have been pitilessly massacred. This important fact seems unknown to our historians, but it is described in the dialogue in Hades between the Marquis de Montcalm and General Wolfe, which is attributed to Mr. Johnston, a very efficient Scots officer who entered service in the French army. I give the exact from this dialogue, in which Montcalm, recounting the fact, thus reproaches Wolfe for having risked the loss of his army by approaching too far near the French entrenchments. Quote, "How can you, sir, justify your imprudence in running headlong into the woods opposite our entrenchments with 2,000 men who naturally ought to have been cut to pieces, and neither you nor any man of your detachment have made your escape? 900 Indians lay in wait within pistol shot of you, and they would have cut your retreat before you discovered them. As soon as the Indians had surrounded you in the woods, they sent their officer, Langlade, to acquaint the Chevalier de Lévis that they had got you in their net, but that your detachment, appearing to be nearly 2,000 strong, greatly superior to their own party, they begged earnestly of the Chevalier de Lévis to order M. de Rapigny to pass the ford and join them with 1,100 men, which he had under his command in the entrenchments. That they would have been answerable with their own lives if a single man of your detachment should return to your camp, but they did not think themselves strong enough to successfully strike the meditated blow without reinforcements of Canadians. There were many officers at M. de Lévis's quarters when Langlade came to him in behalf of those Indians, and the general, having assembled them, gave them his own opinion of the affair, that it seemed to him dangerous to attack an enemy in the woods, whose force they could not well establish, that it might prove to be the whole English army, and consequently a question of bringing on a general engagement for which they were not prepared, and if they were defeated, he would be blamed for having brought on a battle without having received orders from his superiors. All his officers readily endorsed his view, which was very natural out of respect and courtesy to their commander. His aide-de-camp alone entertained a different opinion, which he was constrained to offer from the truest friendship for his general. He declared that there was not the smallest probability that all the English army could be there, since the Indians, who never failed to magnify the numbers, computed them at only 2,000 men, that even supposing it to be the enemy's whole force, it would be the most lucky thing that could happen to us to have a general engagement in the woods, where a Canadian is worth 3 disciplined soldiers, as a soldier in the open field is worth 3 Canadians, and that nothing was more essential than for those who composed 2/3 of the army, which was the case with the Canadians, to select the propitious moment and their own method of fighting. That the English army, on the contrary, was almost entirely composed of regulars, with very few militia. That Chevalier de Lévis could not do better than by ordering M. de Rapigny to cross this river immediately with his detachment, and join the Indians without the least delay. That he should, at the same time, give me speedy information of his adventure, in order to move the remainder of the army towards the ford, so that other regiments should take the place of those marched off, so that the Royal Brazilian regiment, the nearest to the ford, should go directly to take the post of Rapigny, and quit in crossing the river, and observing the same for the rest of the army. That engaging in a general battle, supposing all the English army to be in the woods opposite the ford, would under these circumstances be very desirable. In short, that if there was a probability of our being defeated and repulsed in the woods, which could scarcely happen, according to all human calculations, we had our retreat assured in the recess of the forests, well known to the Canadians, where the English troops could not pursue them, so that in no event could M. de Lévis run the least risk. The aide-de-camp added in conclusion, that when fortune offers her favors, they ought to be snatched with avidity. These reasons made no impression on the M. de Lévis, and Langlade was sent back to the Indians with a negative reply. It was 2 miles from M. de Lévis's quarters to the place where the Indians were in ambush. Langlade came back with new entreaties and earnest solicitations to induce M. de Levis to order Rapigny to cross the ford with his detachment, but the general could not be prevailed upon to give positive directions to Rapigny to join the Indians. M. de Levis, however, wrote a letter to Rapigny by Langlade, in which he stated that, quote, having the greatest confidence in his prudence and good conduct, he might pass the river with his detachment if he saw a certainty of success. End quote. The aide-de-camp told him, whilst he was sealing the letter, that Rapigny had too much judgment and good sense to assume the responsibility of an affair of that importance, and his opinion of Rapigny was immediately justified by his answer requesting M. de Levis to give him a clear and positive order. After having thus lost about an hour and a half, M. de Levis resolved at last to go himself to the ford and there give his orders verbally. But he had scarcely got half-way to it when he heard a brisk fire. The Indians, losing all patience after having remained so long hid, at a pistol shot from you, like settler dogs upon wild fowl, at last gave you a volley, killed about 150 of your soldiers, and then retired without losing a man. It is evident that had Rapigny passed the river with his detachment of 1,100 Canadians, you must have been cut to pieces, and that affair would have terminated your expedition. Your army could not have had any hopes of succeeding after such a loss. Their spirits would have been depressed, and Canada would have been secure from any further invasion from Great Britain. End quote. Jean-Claude Panay, notary, in his Journal of the Siege of Quebec, gives a somewhat different account of this engagement, and reports that the number of killed is only 60. He remarks that the consternation was so great amongst the English that they were attacked by the English that they fled, crying, "All is lost," but that unfortunately no advantage was taken of this stroke. A relation of the operations of the army under M. de Montcalm before Quebec, preserved in the War Archives in Paris, contains the following details on the subject. After having lain flat on the ground for 5 hours in the face of the enemy, without observing the slightest movement amongst our troops, the Indians, carried away at last by their impatience, and seeing, moreover, that the enemy was profiting by it, by bringing fresh troops into the woods, decided to make the attack alone. They were so impetuous, as we were subsequently told by a sergeant, who had deserted the enemy, and 2 Canadians, then prisoners, that the English were obliged to fight retreating more than 200 paces from the place of combat before they could rally. The alarm was so communicated even to the main camp to which General Wolfe had returned. The natives, seeing themselves almost entirely surrounded, effected a retreat after having killed or wounded more than 150 men, losing only 2 or 3 of their own number. They met at the ford of the river Montmorency, the detachment coming to their support, which M. de Levis had been unwilling to take the responsibility of sending until he received an order from M. de Vaudreuil. The whole army regretted that they had not profited by so fine an opportunity. End quote. These testimonies are of unquestionable value. They make it evident that we cannot form too high an opinion of the ability of Langlade, and of the very important services he would have rendered to the French cause, had the Canadian authorities known how to profit by the daring project he had formed to annihilate a projection of the English army. The French generals, unfortunately, too much imbued with the military ideas in vogue in Europe, seemed sometimes to forget that a war in the midst of our woods in Canada and forest ponds could not be carried on under ordinary conditions, and that it was chiefly by surprises and skillfully prepared ambushes that they could succeed in crushing an enemy well disciplined and superior in numbers. It is not strange that they committed errors manifest even to those of their profession, and that their prejudices led them often to reject plans the wisest and best adapted to the true mode of warfare in this country. It will be remarked that Langlade plays in this affair a part very like that which is attributed to him at the Monongahela. Only de Beaujeu was shrewd enough to yield at length to his entreaties, and to open the battle in time to profit by the surprise of the enemy, and to put them completely to rout, while the Chevalier de Lévis, by employing too late with the ardent solicitations of Langlade, lost, according to Johnston, the opportunity to put a probable end to the expedition of the English. Some time after this bold stroke, Langlade took an active part in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham on the 13th of September, 1759. Langlade was not only the sad witness to this disaster, but he had also the grief of seeing his two brothers, or brothers-in-law, fall beside him, as did so many others, paying thus nobly their debt to the country. Aimable de Guerre, one of his companions, affirms that no person evinced more coolness than did Langlade on the field of battle. He seemed to delight in the midst of the din of arms and the yells of the combatants. He relates that a succession of rapid discharges, having one day heated his gun to such a degree that he could not use it again for several minutes, he drew his pipe from his pocket, filled it with tobacco, struck a fire with the aid of his tinder-box, then lighted it, appearing as calm amidst the cannonade and the whirling of bullets as he had been tranquilly seated by the fire in a bivouac. The commandant at Quebec, M. de Ramsay, having capitulated 6 days after this battle, Langlade was of those who thought this measure cowardly, and he with his companions quit the place filled with mortification and disgust. To the summons to surrender, Langlade would have replied like the heroic Frontenac of old to his envoy, a Phipps, quote, "It is by the mouth of my cannon and the missiles of my guns that I will reply to your general." End quote. The capitulation signed, the English troops took immediate possession of the city. The fall of Quebec, received in England with unbounded enthusiasm, spread, on the contrary, consternation throughout the Canadian country, which, after a long glorious effort, was forced to succumb before the invading forces of the enemy. Langlade departed from Michilimackinac after these unhappy events, and returned to Canada early in the following year. A lieutenant's commission, signed by King Louis, awaited him, in reward for his services. It was expressed in the following terms, quote, "By the King, His Majesty having made the choice of Sieur Langlade to serve in the capacity of half-paid lieutenant in connection with the troops stationed in Canada, he commands the Lieutenant General of New France to receive him, and to cause him to be recognized in the said capacity of half-paid lieutenant by all those and others whom it may concern. Louis, done at Versailles, February 1st, 1760. In the absence of positive information, we have every reason to believe that Langlade fought under the Chevalier de Lévis when that intrepid general, at the head of a noble force of French troops and of Canadian militia, triumphed for the last time on the 28th of April, 1760, upon the identical field of the defeat of Montcalm. The timely arrival of considerable reinforcements from England unhappily rendered useless the prodigies of valor achieved by the Canadians, and in consequence of the cruel desertion by the French, they were forced to witness, with resignation, their country fall into the hands of their ancient enemy. The governor of the colony, M. de Vaudreuil, no longer indulging a hope of ability to resist the English, gave to Langlade on the 3rd of September the following instructions. Quote, "Pierre Rigaud, Marquis de Vaudreuil, Grand Cross of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis, Governor and Lieutenant General for the King in all of New France, and in the lands of Louisiana. Sieur Langlade, half-paid lieutenant of the troops of the colony, whom we have charged with the superintendence of the Indian nations of the upper country, which are returning to their villages, is ordered to use his utmost diligence to report with them at Michilimackinac, to watch that they commit no theft, nor offer any insult to the canoes of the voyageurs whom they may meet on their route, always to encourage them in their attachment to the French nation, making them feel that if they have the misfortune to be taken by the enemy, the colony could at the utmost remain only a few months in its power, and that if peace is not actually, it is probably on the point of being made. We notify Sieur Langlade that he is by our orders to transfer 2 companies of deserters from the English troops by way of the upper country to be sent to Louisiana, which companies are commanded by 2 sergeants, one Irish and one German, both very intelligent and quite capable of preserving discipline in their troops. Sieur Langlade will therefore take care that his Indians stir up no quarrel with these deserters, nor commit theft, nor insult them while they are under their escort. He will also procure for them all their facilities of which they may have need along the way, and which may devolve upon him. And he will also select such Canadians to guide these deserters as will not abandon them. Done at Montreal, the 3rd of September, 1760, Vaudreuil. End quote. 6 days later, Vaudreuil sent the following dispatch to Langlade, in which he announced the capitulation of Montreal, made known to him its conditions, especially those which might directly affect the inhabitants of the western posts. Quote, Montreal, 9th of September, 1760. I inform you, sir, that I have today been obliged to capitulate with the army of General Amherst. This city is, as you know, without defenses. Our troops were considerably diminished, our means and resources exhausted. We were surrounded by 3 armies, amounting in all to 20,080 men. General Amherst was, on the 6th of this month, in sight of the walls of the city. General Murray within reach of one of our suburbs, and the army of Lake Champlain was at La Prairie and Longueuil. Under these circumstances, with nothing to hope from our efforts, nor even from the sacrifice of our troops, I have advisedly decided to capitulate with General Amherst upon conditions very advantageous for the colonists, in particular for the inhabitants of Michilimackinac. Indeed, they retain the free exercise of their religion, they are maintained in the possession of their goods, real and personal, and of their peltries. They have also free trade, just as the same prosperous subjects of the King of Great Britain. The same conditions are accorded to the military. They can appoint persons to act for them in their absence. They, and all citizens in general, can sell to the English or French their goods, sending the proceeds thereof to France, or taking them with them, if they choose to return to that country after the peace. They retain their Negroes and Pawnee Indian slaves, but will be obliged to restore those which have been taken from the English. The English general has declared that the Canadians have become subjects of His Britannic Majesty, and consequently the people will not continue to be governed as therefore by the French code. In regard to the troops, the condition has been imposed upon them not to serve during the present war, and to lay down their arms before being sent back to France. You will therefore, sir, assemble all the officers and soldiers who are at your post. You will cause them to lay down their arms, and you will proceed with them to such seaports as you think best, to pass from thence to France. The citizens and inhabitants of Michilimackinac will consequently be under the command of the officer whom General Amherst shall appoint to that post. You will forward a copy of my letter to St. Joseph's and to the neighboring posts, in order that if any soldiers remain there, they and the inhabitants may conform thereto. I count upon the pleasure of seeing you in France with all your officers. I have the honor to be, very sincerely, monsieur, your most humble and obedient servant, Vaudreuil. End quote. The Memoir of Grignon expresses surprise that, notwithstanding services so remarkable, Langlade has scarcely been known in history. The author thinks, however, that the oblivion which unjustly rests upon his memory may be largely attributed to the departure of the French troops for the mother country after the surrender of Canada, together with the natural repugnance of the vanquished to awaken the memories of this war, however glorious they might be. This observation is not without justice. The memorial of Saint Helene, alluding to the terrible reverses of Napoleon, truthfully remarks that, quote, in our last moments a multitude of exploits and of historical facts that have been lost in the confusion of our disasters and in the abyss of our misfortunes. End quote. This would be equally true of us. We have, moreover, reason to believe that the silence of history upon these heroic deeds of de Langlade is not due solely to this cause. May it not be in part attributed to the unjust bias of the regular troops against the Canadian militia, which had its source in an exaggerated idea of their own military superiority. This prejudice was shared by many French generals, and Montcalm himself was not wholly free from it. Lévis, one of the few French commanders who knew how to appreciate the Canadian soldier at his true value, and he knew how to use, to marvelous advantage, these hardy men possessing such rare military qualities. To what extent certain French officers ventured to detract from the merit of the Canadians is quite evident from the following words written by one of them to the War Minister in France, quote, "The Canadian is wicked, a liar, boastful, very convenient for skirmishing, very brave behind a tree, and extremely timid when unsheltered." End quote. It is easy for us to treat with contempt the accusation of cowardice brought against our fathers, for every page of our history furnishes its refutation. To make this injustice more obvious, we content ourselves with stating that after the defeat of Montcalm's army, when the living forces of the country seemed exhausted, we find one of the most touching evidences of courage that could be given by a people. Quote, "We had not counted upon so strong an army, because we did not expect to have so large a number of Canadians. The intention was only to assemble the men in a condition to sustain the fatigues of war, but such emulation prevailed among this people, that there were seen arriving in camp old men 80 years of age, and children of 12 and 13 years, who were unwilling to profit by the exemption accorded to their age. Never were subjects more worthy of the favors of their sovereign. In the army they were exposed to all fatigue duty." End quote. It is a flagrant indignity to affix to the brow of such people the stigma of the crowd, when it ought to rather be envisioned with the crowd of the hero. It is not perhaps unnecessary to remark that to have known how to fight behind a tree would not, at a time, have had the injustice import to which this expression seems to admit, and by no means mitigates against the reputation for bravery to which these Canadians have acquired so just a title. For it was then the best method of making war in this country, the only means of supplying the deficiency in our numbers, of economizing the strength which our growing weakness forbade us to waste, and of preparing surprises fatal to the enemy, as, for instance, among others, the glorious battle of the Monongahela. If the French generals had been less fond of fighting after the European style, that is to say, unsheltered, if they had better understood the absolute necessity for confining themselves to skirmishing and woods fighting, in the exhausted state of the country, exhausted as to men, supplies, and ammunition, they would, perhaps, have avoided some of the errors so prejudicial to the cause of France. To speak only of Montcalm, one of the officers present at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, reproaches him, among other grave faults, with, quote, "not having known how to profit by the nature of the country, to station by platoons in the thickets the Canadians, who, arranged in that manner, would certainly surpass as marksmen all the troops in the world." End quote. In a letter dated the 23rd of October, 1757, addressed to the Minister of War, the Marquis de Vaudreuil shows how little value was put upon the Canadians, of whom he always proved himself a zealous defender. Evidently, the arrogance affected by certain Englishmen of the present day in their dealings with the children of the soil is no new thing. We suffered at that time from their superciliousness of Europeans very much as we do now. In no other way can the silence of history be explained than by this prejudice against the Canadians. Take as a memorable case in point the important act by Langlade in the victory of the Monongahela, for if we credit his testimony, together with the positive declarations of General Burgoyne and of Von Burney, an officer of the English army, We must have been the real victor in that battle. Meanwhile, his name does not appear even in the French accounts, where the names of inferior officers were scrupulously recorded. There is the same systematic silence upon the other deeds not less meritorious. Without the authorized testimony of a Scottish officer, Mr. Johnston, author of the Dialogue in Hades between Montcalm and Wolfe, we should be ignorant of the daring surprise projected by Langlade before the fatal battle of the Plains of Abraham, to cut to pieces, in large part, Wolfe's army, which might have resulted in preserving Canada to France. Other accounts, it is true, describe this daring undertaking. One of them even acknowledges that the whole French army regretted that advantage was not taken of so fine an opportunity to worst the enemy. But it is very careful not to connect the name of Langlade with this exploit. Does not all this remarkable resemblance a regular conspiracy? The conspiracy of silence against a man of incontestable merit, who appears to have given umbrage to certain personages at that time. Happily, light begins to dawn upon those deeds. New documents and authentic writings are constantly being exhumed, and bring to our notice names of men unjustly ignored, to whom history will justly accord the profound admiration which paltry jealousies or the bad faith of their contemporaries too often refuse them. Their glory will be neither less brilliant nor less durable for having been tardily revealed to us. The English, after the war, took possession of all the western posts. They generally placed them in pretty strong garrison, protected by cannon, in order to make sure authority respected by the coureurs de bois and the natives, who appeared not at all disposed to receive them favorably. These posts, with the exception of that of Detroit, were not all occupied immediately. The fort of Michilimackinac did not receive an English garrison until 1761, and during that interval it remained in possession of the Canadians, who carried on the trade in that distant region. The first English commandant of the fort was Captain George Etherington. He was probably a brave soldier, but he does not seem to have been quite equal to his position. Very soon after his arrival at the fort, Captain Etherington invited the principal French traders who remained in the surrounding country to come and take oath of allegiance, and to confer with him upon certain matters of local administration. This was in all respects a wise step. It gave the commandant the opportunity to learn the necessities of the situation, and was calculated to inspire the Canadians with confidence in the policy of their new masters. Augustin and Charles de Langlade accepted the invitation of Captain Etherington, and repaired to Michilimackinac, accompanied by their wives and children and several Pawnee slaves which belonged to them. This visit had the best results. Captain Etherington received the Langlades with extreme kindness, and did everything in his power to ingratiate himself with men so influential. As a proof of his desire to forget the animosity of the past, he even continued Charles de Langlade in his function of superintendent of the Indians for the division of Green Bay, and of commander of the militia. It was a double favor, of which Langlade was more sensible because it was altogether unexpected. Among the few papers of Langlade that remain to us is the following permission to reside in Green Bay, Michilimackinac, April 13, 1763. I have this day given permission to Messieurs Langlade, father and son, to remain at the post of L'Abbaye, and do thereby order that no person may interrupt them in their voyage hither, with their wives, children, servants, and baggage. Geo. Etherington, Commandant. The conquest of the country was accomplished, but it was not once followed by complete reconciliation. The dying embers of war rekindled with their sinister gleams in the northwest, and for some time threatened to make serious ravages. The most of the Indian tribes, to whom the memory of France had not ceased to be dear, were unwilling to submit to the English, and they organized against them a powerful conspiracy which barely failed of complete success. This conspiracy had been skillfully planned by one of the greatest warriors that the Indians ever produced, the illustrious Pontiac, the sworn enemy of the English, whom, in the vehemence of his language, he called, dogs disguised as men, and garments always stained with blood. The plan was to get possession by force or stratagem of the English forts, to massacre the garrisons or make them prisoners, to seize their arms and supplies, in short, to drive them from the country whose home they had valiantly fought during 3/4 of a century under the flag of France. On the birthday of King George, the 4th of June, 1763, the natives repaired to the fort and proposed to Captain Etherington a festival with a grand game of Begadaway, a kind of ball play. The natives excel at this game, which has long been in vogue amongst them, and Captain Etherington willingly acceded to their request. He was far from suspecting that this inoffensive play concealed a terrible design. For the better to dissemble their perfidy, the natives had devoted themselves to the same amusement during the preceding days. The game was to take place on the large plain adjacent to the fort. The hour for the contest having arrived, Captain Etherington and Lieutenant Leslie took a position outside the fort, and some steps from the gate in order to better observe the movements of the players. The former seemed above all interested in the struggle, for, in accordance with his promise, he had made wagers in favor. The game was pursued with great ardor from the morning until midday, without the victory being decided in favor of either tribe. Many times already the ball had been intentionally thrown inside the palisades of the fort, and then been sent out by the soldiers of the garrison, but as Etherington wished to give the Indians all possible facilities, he finally ordered the gates of the fort thrown open that they might themselves go in search of the ball. This was exactly what they desired, and very soon they tossed the ball again inside the fort, rushing on in its pursuit. Their women also, in obedience to orders, precipitated themselves within the palisade in order to give themselves tomahawks, which they held concealed under their blankets. This was the signal for general massacre. The natives began to utter their terrible war cry and then to slaughter all the soldiers who fell under their hands. The latter, for the most part, unarmed, were grouped unsuspectingly near the palisade of the fort, in order to better observe the functions of the game. Lieutenant Jamet defended himself, pressed on all sides by 5 natives, unarmed save his sword, with which he contended valiantly for his life. It was not till the 36th wound from the tomahawk that he was stretched upon the field. Rendered furious by his courageous resistance, they cut off his head and carried it about in triumph. The number of victims reached 17, including an English trader named Tracy. The surviving soldiers were taken prisoner, and 5 of them were subsequently massacred. Langlade witnessed the horrors of this carnage, but could do nothing to arrest it. In the inferior condition of the natives, it would have been certain death to anyone to take part on behalf of the English. Captain Etherington and Lieutenant Leslie happily escaped the fate of their companions. Being found outside the fort after the massacre, the natives seized upon them, stripped them of their clothing, and dragged them into the forest. After some deliberation, they decided to burn them at the stake. In fact, the wood was prepared, the prisoners bound, and the torch about to be applied to the pike, when Langlade, informed of the terrible fate which threatened them, came in all haste to their succor, at the head of a certain number of loyal Ottawas, from L'Arbre Crochet, situated upon the shores of Lake Michigan, 50 miles from Michilimackinac. Without any formalities, he cut the cords which bound the captives to the stake. After having restored Etherington and Leslie to liberty, he said to the unfortunate commandant, quote, "Captain Etherington, if you had listened to my old women's tales, which forewarned you of the peril, you would not have now been in the position so humiliating, nor would the greater part of your men have been numbered with the slain." End quote. The priest mentioned in Etherington's letter is Pierre de Jaunet, of whom we have already spoken. This courageous missionary, who had already rendered the greatest service to the English prisoners in the hands of the Ottawas, in order to be still farther useful to them, did not fear to expose himself to the dangers and fatigues of a long and monotonous canoe voyage upon Lake Huron. He accomplished his mission with fidelity, had an interview with Major Gladwin, then left Detroit to return to Michilimackinac on the 20th of June, 1763, as we learn by the following extract from a curious narrative entitled Diary of the Siege of Detroit. Quote, June 20th, 1763. This morning the Commandant gave to the Jesuit a memorandum of what he should say to the Indians and French at Michilimackinac, as also to Captain Etherington, seeing he did not choose to carry a letter, saying that if he was asked by the Indians if he had any, he would be obliged to say yes, as he had never told a lie in his life. He gave him a belt to give to the Ottawas there, desiring him to tell them that he was very well pleased with their not having meddled in an affair which must have brought on their ruin, and that if they would not send their prisoners to Montreal, they would convince the general of their good intentions, for which they would probably be well rewarded. He was to present to M. de Langlade and Farley his compliments, and thank them for the good offices, which he exhorted them to continue. They were to strive as much as possible to prevent all commerce with our enemies, above all, that of arms and ammunition. M. de Langlade was authorized to command at the fort in accordance with Captain Etherington's directions, until further notice. End quote. When the War of the American Revolution broke out, Charles de Langlade was 46 years old, but his age sat lightly upon him. At the solicitation of Captain de Peyster of Michilimackinac, he resolved, if his services were required, to take an active part in the war, which, according to the miscellanies of this officer, quote, secured in our interest all the Western Indians. End quote. Indeed, he was very soon authorized to raise an Indian force, quote, and attack the rebels every time he met them, end quote, to use the language of Captain de Peyster's orders. Embodying a numerous force of Sioux, Sauk, Fox, Menominee, Winnebagoes, Ottawa, Chippewas, Langlade marched for Montreal. Upon their arrival in that city, a grand council was held with all the ceremonies so dear to the Indians. Larocque, the interpreter of the Sioux, being unable to fulfill his functions, Langlade translated the speeches of the chiefs of that tribe into the Chippewa dialect, which was familiar to almost all the Indians of the Northwest, interpreting afterwards into French all that was said in Chippewa. It is well known that a war feast preceded most Indian expeditions, and care was taken on this occasion that this ancient and solemn custom should not be omitted. At the banquet which was given, an ox was roasted whole and served to these voracious guests, who speedily devoured it. The army of General John Burgoyne, about 8,500 soldiers and 500 natives strong, was to invade New York and effect its junction with General Howe at Albany. It assembled at Crown Point the 13th of June, 1777, and began its movement early in July. Langlade rejoined Burgoyne's army with his natives at Skanesborough, now Whitehall, at the end of July, 1777. He was accompanied by his brave old friend, the Chevalier Luc de la Corne, who, though 66 years old, had not hesitated, at the request of the Governor of Canada, Sir Guy Carleton, to take the direction of some native bands which had come to reinforce the English army. We know that having won some easy triumphs, Burgoyne afterwards suffered many defeats, and was at length ignominiously beaten at Saratoga, October the 14th, 1777, when he, with his army, was obliged to capitulate. This disaster caused an immense sensation in England, and public opinion almost unanimously condemned the unfortunate general for the incapacity and imprudence which he had shown. Burgoyne tried to justify his conduct by pamphlets and by speeches in the House of Commons, where he had powerful friends. Desirous to throw the responsibility of his reverses upon others, he attacked with severity the conduct of the Canadians and Indians, complaining bitterly of their indifference or desertion, and involving their intrepid commander in the same blame. The Indian allies of the English, at the end of the year 1778, received orders to assemble at L'Arbre Crochet, in Michigan, to reinforce Lieutenant Governor Hamilton, who was marching against the American general, Clark. The latter had taken possession of the whole region of the Illinois, and it was important that opposition to further encroachments should be organized with all possible speed. Langlade was always, during these different campaigns, accompanied by several lieutenants, who, with rare courage, shared his good and evil fortunes. Chief among these heroes was his nephew, Gautier de Verville, who has often been mentioned in the course of his narrative. This man of tried courage gave Langlade many proofs of his entire devotion to him. He was present at Braddock's defeat, and in the terrible battle of the Plains of Abraham, where he afterwards took part in the Revolutionary War, during which his courageous conduct earned him a commission as captain. After peace was declared, he went to live at Michilimackinac, where he cultivated land, acting as a time as interpreter between the English government and the natives. Langlade, to the end of his life, retained his position of Superintendent of Indian Affairs, which gave him a very good income. His services to the English cause during the Revolutionary War had been sufficiently appreciated to secure him a life annuity of $800, besides a grant for 3,000 acres of land on the borders of the River Thames, then known under the name of La Trenche, in the province of Ontario. He also had considerable lands at Green Bay, which for a long time were cultivated on his behalf by his son-in-law, Pierre Grignon. Langlade, exhausted by age and the fatigues of his laborious life, died in 1800 after a brief illness. After having nobly defended the French flag during many years, he remained afterwards equally faithful to the English crown, showing on all occasions admirable devotion and courage. Few warriors could offer a finer record of service. But military skill and tried courage will not be Langlade's only title in regards to posterity. He can also claim the glory, less striking perhaps, but not less meritorious, of having been one of the most intrepid pioneers of the West, of having been one of the first to brave the dangers presented by its fierce natives, in laying, in the midst of the wilderness, the humble foundations of institutions now prosperous and full of promise. It is of this that the American people have already shown a recognition in bestowing upon him the glorious title, the Father of Wisconsin.